entirely from the scratch, but I really started to sort of wonder about the scene because very originally a few years ago I was actually invited to be in the Wacken medal battle Estonia in jury, and in semi-finals they had 10 bands playing. I went to Tallinn and they had the shows and we had our jury things, and I have to admit I didn't know any of the 10 bands, even though there were some bands that had been playing for almost 20 years. There were some newer bands as well. And I started to wonder sort of why is this? Obviously one reason is that the scene is rather small, and another reason is that most of the Estonian bands, they haven't really gone international. So actually the only one that I'm sort of briefly talking about would be Metsätöl. Metsätöl is perhaps the only Estonian band that is more widely recognized abroad. They've been playing in these kind of pagan and folk metal festivals all over the world, and they've been opening up for bands like Ensiferum or LOAG or Korpiklaani. So they're not a big band either, but that's the only one that might be recognized. And they are sort of local heroes to some degree in Estonia as well. So in overall, I also noticed that there's no previous studies on the Estonian metal scene. And by the way, I'm talking also Estonian metal scene or Tallinn metal scene, because Tallinn is more or less the hub of the metal scene. And in terms of population, Estonia has 1.3 million people, and a third of the population is really living around in Tallinn. And that's actually where the metal scene is taking place. There's a couple of places and a few clubs and events elsewhere as well, but it's really Tallinn centered. So I really sort of hasn't, at first point, especially when this book idea came out, building some kind of rough overview of the scene. And how I did, I'm still sort of, as I said, a little bit middle of data, but I really started, there's quite a good site called estonianmetal.com, and that's sort of a good site for finding out bands. But the problem with that is that it sort of existed until 2015. It's still there, but I was told that nobody's really updating it anymore. They're sort of, the bands were very active for 10 years to adding their material, and they were sort of hosts who kept the site alive. And basically all this kind of discussion and all these updates, they are now in social media, especially the Facebook. Estonian Metal, they have also the Facebook site. But it's mainly on Estonian language, but there's more current information. But that was quite a nice starting data for my own research, because there were lots of interviews. Sort of, I went to 83 interviews through that site, and some additional one as well. But of course, that was missing the most current sort of description of the scene. I also wanted to go a little bit further down to the history, because it's pretty new stuff there. So I arranged face-to-face interview with sort of 7 key persons in Tallinn, including musicians, metal industry operators, pioneers, and newer scene members, all the way from the 80s and to the newer guys. And yeah, I was wondering that it's only 7 and they could be to double the amount, but actually many of the people, how I did it, because I had some friends already in Tallinn, and I asked around that who would be the sort of really the key persons that I should include in this kind of study, and I more or less got all of them, and there was one key person saying already that I think you know most of the guys from the scene actually. And it's sort of striking already, because it's just a small number of people. Of course there are sort of more bands than that. And then different kind of casual chats, but I'm still probably going to do some kind of online sort of questionnaire about the scene more in general, as might be more interesting, get a little bit wider view. But I really, in my paper and in this current version, I really got this kind of narrative approach to reflect the nature of living metal scenes, how the participants are experiencing the scene themselves. And there were a couple of sort of themes that seems to be rising from the interviews and the overall study, sort of cohesion within the scene, that it's quite cohesive, it's quite sort of coherent, it's very packed, but at the same time there are sort of what I call subdivisions. I'm coming back to that very briefly later. And of course, interestingly, one interesting sort of starting point for me was because Estonia used to be one of the Soviet countries for 50 years, so I was still thinking how does it affect the current scene, especially, and the history of the scene. Are there some specific characteristics that are really brought by the politics and also by the geographics? Because the country is sort of in a nice position, because it's surrounded by these whole Nordic countries, which are really metal countries, especially for the last 20 years. So, and here in this presentation, I'm mainly talking about a little bit like the history and what I call different waves. Surprisingly, I'm talking about waves. That's a very trendy thing in metal. But I think there were sort of three waves that could be identified in the history of Estonian metal. And then finally, a couple of remarks on this couple of themes. But I start with one video clip from '87. I think that's a nice one. Heavy Savi was the very first metal or heavy rock festival in Estonia. Heavy Suvi, Heavy Summer, '87. I want to show a little bit the audience as well. Yeah, to give you an idea, yeah, I'm not so sure about the heaviness of the music itself. And that's sort of remarkable. Of course, it was still sort of 4 years until the regaining of independence in Estonia, but already at that time there was this perestroika and classness politics taking force, and it was actually possible to start organizing things like that. And yeah, there was still the state control from Soviet Union on all kind of activities, especially rock activities, because they were sort of suspicious. But still, at that time, it was more like it wasn't any really so active. They were still controlling, as my informant says, but it was still possible already to do stuff. But still not, of course, in a very extreme forms. And I actually already in the early '80s, also in Tallinn, there started to be sort of small punk scene emerging, as in many other parts of the world, and also the heavy rock scenes and at the time heavy rock and part of the metal scenes all started to emerge early in the '80s. And interesting was also that the music seems to be playing a very important role in as a whole in this change, in providing Estonian people louder voice, and really like giving a new hopes of independence even before sort of 90s in the late 80s. There was a lot of things, a lot of other scholars have been studying in Finland, especially this kind of sort of popular singing events in Tallinn, that sort of like singing all kinds of songs, and that was really part of the creating spirit for this independence already before everything happened. And yeah, of course, the independence was then sort of big watershed, because they sort of gave totally different like atmosphere and all different possibilities also for the bands and the scenes to emerge. And like yeah, there would be so many good anecdotes and quotes from my interviews, but like one of the guys saying that in the times of the Soviet ruling, it was not allowed to play gigs without a permit. All bands had to perform at first for special commission which is interesting, who examined the playing skills, music and lyrics, of course. So it seems that it was not only about the contents of the lyrics or sort of the form of the performance, but also they wanted to probably give some kind of like quality level, what is the sort of right kind of performing for the youth in the Soviet state. And probably pretty much the same kind of atmosphere that we heard already a couple of presentations during this conference about the Soviet and Moscow scenes, and probably what Wolf is going to tell about the DDR as well later on. So the sort of what I call the first wave really started sort of course around the independence, and really what early on became quite clear, and later in all of these different during these waves, that the events and events and certain places are really that should be actually events and places as the early metal scene even later. So there was quite a few things that were established already before the independence, like the Heavy Summer, Heavy Suvi Festival that you saw. There was another one called Rock Summer Festival in '88. These were all that most of the interviews were referring as the seminal sort of starting points. And especially 1990 Tartu Music Days. Tartu is another city in Estonia. And one of the big things in